Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It's such a wonderful opportunity to have the opportunity to speak to you today. So thank you. I want to thank Morgan Barry so much for this invitation to speak and for the opportunity to meet with so many incredible art students. I also want to thank Bob Atwell for your tireless support in terms of setting up the Furlong Gallery. Thank you very much, both of you. So as Morgan said, I'm a practicing artist based in New Mexico. I'm also an associate professor based at the University of New Mexico, where I teach in the Honors College. I teach interdisciplinary courses at the intersection of photography, art, graphic memoir, philosophy. And you'll see like threads of those different ideas and spheres within this talk today. I want to start by kind of giving you a sense of what the talk will sort of look like. I'll be starting with earlier works to kind of give you a sense of where I've been in my career and why I made this most recent body of work. And in many ways, the work, all of the pieces that I've done sort of orbit around this idea of delicate relationships. So I'm interested, early on, I was interested in the relationship between mind and body. Then I became interested in like two partners falling in love. And then upon becoming a parent, I became interested in the relationship between a mother and child. And then, you know, due to recent fires in New Mexico, it felt like a natural turn to looking at the environment around me and the relationship between humans and the natural world. My goals for this presentation today are to give you a sense of my creative process, to show you the evolution of various ideas and how early ideas in my career kind of came back in some ways to this work that's on view in the Furlong Gallery, and to give you some sources of inspiration that are both visual, scholarly, and literary. In terms of delicate relationships, this installation called Flight Patterns of Empty Energy explores the interweaving between two partners in love. The installation includes photographs, textiles, time-based media, glass, and ice. And for me, they function metaphorically to explore the impermanence of the physical body and the meshing of two bodies in love. And I explore this idea materially through this foregrounded sculpture. So here, I froze the amount of water that was in two specific bodies. And I had this huge chunk of ice that eventually melted and became a kind of reflecting pool in this plexi tray. Suspended above that was this kind of mesh-like, gauze-like fabric that was equivalent to the surface area of those two bodies. And then you have a tree that's sort of suspended above this in need of this liquid for sustenance that's the exact height of one of those partners. And so here I'm kind of looking at this idea of like this scientific sort of breakdown of these two bodies, of these two people in love, but then also this like ephemeral sort of state or experience of loving someone. And this kind of fluidity and interconnection of identity is a theme that you'll see me come back to for my newer body of work and shared breath motherhood in the time of climate crisis. This work was created with a scientific tool called LIDAR. It's a tool that's often used by scientists to map reflectivity, and it creates a kind of point cloud of data. It's often used to measure like the Earth's surface in 3D, including mountain ranges, buildings, vegetation. And so here I use the laser to record the relationship of bodies. And the results are these bodies with no hard distinction between the figures. You can kind of turn the data points in 3D and move them around, and you can see that like they're almost like silhouettes of the figures, but the points themselves start to merge together. So I was interested in like how to use this as a way of talking about falling in love and merging your identity with your partners. And during this time I was reading work by Rebecca Solnit, and she has a quote that I feel like kind of helps crystallize these ideas. She says, quote, "The desire to go home is a desire to be whole, to know where you are, to be the point of intersection of all the lines drawn through all the stars, to be the constellation maker and the center of the world, that center called love." My creative exploration to identity and love led me to naturally explore my identity, my new identity upon becoming a mother. After my children were born, I felt like I fell in love with them anew in a completely different way. So this series, Mi Familia, is comprised of photographic images that explore the vulnerability, intimacy, and joy of motherhood and familial life. And the work uses personal and universal perspectives to convey the complexities of this pivotal life experience. The images in the series investigate the ephemeral nature of childhood and the successes and failures of motherhood. and my children's relationship with the natural world. And the work explores moments that normally wouldn't be part of a family photo album, but rather they function as a kind of visual metaphor. Joyous and at times melancholic, the photographs explore fleeting and momentous occasions, as well as the detritus of childhood, a forgotten half-eaten ice cream cone, or the weightless feeling of being outside. The series explores kinesthetic experiences that tie us to place, ones that are often dormant in adulthood. That might be the feeling of fresh snow on one's tongue or the warmth of the summer rays on one's skin. The work seeks to create empathy, elicit nostalgia, and honor the sanctity of childhood through the creation of moments that are filled with the magic of play and the captivating aspects of nature as seen through the intimacy of a mother's eyes. And in many ways, as a mother and a photographer, there's a haunting quality to the fleetingness of time. My relationship to these images changes the longer I am from the making of them. The further I am from the moment when light bounced off my child and hit my camera sensor, the more I reflect and reposition these images in my mind. My work is inspired by feminist mother artists such as Sally Mann, Rinko Kawuchi, and Eleanor Carucci. Sally Mann, in the image in the right, has explored the impermanence of identity, the importance of identity, family, and place throughout her work, especially in her seminal series, Immediate Family. And this image here on the right comes from a newer series called Faces, in which she makes close-up portraits in which her grown children are practically breathing on the lens of the camera, effectively blurring the boundaries between self and other. Japanese artist Rinko finds wonder in quiet moments of daily life through the beauty of light, composition, and form. Her image is the top left image. And these images in many ways seem to kind of translate into a kind of visual haiku. Whereas Israeli-American photographer Eleanor Carucci is interested in using photography to break down personal and private boundaries. These artists embrace an example of art making that integrates one's daily life, such as parenthood, into the process of making art. And in that way, the work honors a collaborative approach. And also, I'm drawn to the works and to this approach because it rejects a Kantian perspective of art, one that separates art from the function and process of daily life, but rather embraces art making as an extension of it. I started making this work as artist mothers nationally and internationally began dialogues about the need for representation of female artists and the importance of motherhood as a topic of art making. Intertwining my role as a mother and an artist has helped me to foster a daily recognition of the beauty and fleetingness of the world around us. And I believe art at its best challenges, encourages, and inspires us to see the world anew. While the majority of the images in the Mi Familia series highlight my children, there are moments when my presence is evident, as in this image. And this series ultimately led me to continue to explore motherhood through a series of photographic portraits of other mothers. During the Victorian era, photographs were rare and precious. Photographic processes were relatively crude, definitely according to today's standard, and as a result, exposure times were often quite long. Sometimes they would be a few seconds up to several minutes. Mothers who wanted a record of their children were instructed to hide themselves under a piece of fabric or a blanket in order to hold their children to ensure a sharp image. So you can see here, this bottom left is a historic, what is referred to as hidden mother image. I came across the book The Hidden Mother, which was a collection of tintypes and daguerreotypes of hidden mother images. And I started to think about how strange this process was and how, the absence of the mother in these Victorian images maybe said something about the importance of the role of mothers and motherhood. And I was interested in whether or not those ideas were applicable now, and if I could use the cloaking technique that was used in these images in a metaphoric way in contemporary times. And so in my Hidden Mother series, I create formally similar images to their Victorian counterparts as a metaphor for the unrecognized physical and emotional work that mothers do to support and nurture their children. And I started creating this body of work in the wake of Anne-Marie Slattery's article, Why Women Still Can't Have It All, and Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, that led to these larger cultural discussions about what it means to balance personal and professional identities. I aim to use photography as a tool, a social and political tool, to query the role of mothers in society. I became curious about other mothers' experiences, and I reached out to the Santa Fe mothering group called Raising Santa Fe, and I was able to collaborate with both mothers from that group as well as my network of friends and family in the area to begin this series. In each of the images, a mother is wrapped in a floral bedlin that elicits traditional notions of femininity and domestic spaces, and very much sort of exploring the interplay between hiding and revealing. And you can see in some images, like the image on the left, the mother is almost like becomes a kind of wallflower, like sinking into the background, whereas the baby is highlighted. Whereas in other images, you see a foregrounding of aspects of the mother's identity, like her tattoos. In an era where mothers are experiencing statistically increased parental time commitments, rising healthcare costs, and pressures to intensively parent, mothering is not only personal but political. Several of the images in this series are displayed as diptychs, two images that are meant to be presented together. So I have the photograph, and then also I use the sheet that I used to cloak the mother with, and then I laser cut into that, that piece of fabric, and then have it sort of adhered to a board with text. And so I used text from various feminist scholars, such as Audre Lorde and Maya Angelou, to express the joy and complexities of motherhood. This diptych articulates the love, but also the lifelong responsibility for being a mother with the phrase, "an invisible thread pulled taut between us." Mothers are navigating a world where their roles as nurturer can feel sidelined and invisible. There's a tension for mothers to parent in a system that heralds productivity over the act of nurturing. In the 1980s, we see the advent of helicopter parenting, but now we see something even more intense, which is called intensive parenting. And we see in the New York Times article called "The Relentlessness of Modern Parenting" that parents, particularly mothers, feel stress, exhaustion, and guilt at the demands of intensive parenting, especially while holding a job. American time use diaries show that the time women spend partnering spend parenting comes at the expense of sleep, time alone with their partners and friends, and leisure time. The text on the left says, "Is good enough enough?" And this is a question that many mothers pose to themselves due to the expectations of modern intensive parenting. On the right, we see the text, "Eyes steady in the face of love." And I feel like the statement hints at the joy and challenges. These statements hint at the joys and challenges of motherhood. As New York journalist Claire Kane Miller states, quote, "Work and parenting have become more demanding. The result is that women's expectations seem to be outpacing the realities of public policy, workplace culture, and family life. If mothering matters in our culture, then we need to recognize the important, rewarding, and complex work that is parenthood by supporting mothers and fathers, by allowing them to parent in a tangible way. This should take the form of paid family leave, flexible work environments, and equitable pay that is protected by law." Continuing with an investigation of the role of art as a tool for social and political inquiry, I want to discuss my participation in a Yellow Rose project. This was conceived by artists Meg Griffiths and Francis Jakubak, who are photographers and curators. And at the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote, during the centennial, they invited 100 photographers to respond to that particular moment in time. And I had the opportunity to collaborate with students, honor students at the University of New Mexico, to create work in response to this, to reflect on the continuing needs, like the advancements that had been made, as well as the continuing needs for equality. The image on the left here pairs a historic image of a suffragette with Juliet Marlowe, and that's layered on top of her kind of contemporary likeness, feminist Tilcara Webb, as a kind of compression of time and space. And on the right, using a poetic tone, the image investigates the ongoing battle for reproductive rights. The work seeks to make connections from the 1920s to present day regarding power and independence. The right to cast a vote in a democracy, or the right to make decisions about one's body, mark a continued fight for independence. And this exploration feels particularly resonant in today's political climate. I want to shift gears a little bit in this section of the talk and talk a little bit about process, because I feel like sometimes in these talks it can be easy to be like, oh yeah, poof, it just came out of the air, the ether, and here's the work, right? But like, it's not without a lot of like work and a lot of iteration. And so I'm using this image of a bowerbird's nest. If you have looked at like Planet Earth, maybe you've seen that like these bowerbirds are pretty incredible. They're very aesthetic. They are drawn to blue materials. Unfortunately, that often means plastics, but they decorate their nest as a way of like kind of drawing attention to themselves and to like impress their mates. But I use this nest here to talk about this idea of like artistic practice and how I like build meaning from like these little threads. So like a bowerbird, I feel like my process begins with making a nest. And for me, that is like taking little threads of things, like these little plastic pieces, from all different sources. It might be you know, an image that I see of someone else's work that inspires me somehow. It might be an object, it might be a quote, it might be a passage. It might be a note written in the liminal space between sleep and wake. I often like dream about projects, and then 50% of the time, whatever I've written does not make any sense. And 50% of the time, there's like a thread there that like, oh, this could be something. So I try to stay awake to the world around me and to like how ideas begin to form. And I keep doing this until I'm able to articulate a feeling or an idea that I hope to express or evoke in the work. So the seed of much of my work is like rooted in personal experiences and reflections, but ultimately the work aims to map onto like larger universal dialogues. Continuing with this idea of like experiments, so I was talking to one of the groups, Morgan's class earlier today, that sometimes projects are like off-ramps, like you do it and then you're like, that's not gonna go anywhere, right? But sometimes the thread of that experimentation can lead to something else. So I'm showing you a few of my off-ramps to then later talk about how threads of that like manifests itself in my newer work. So during the pandemic, everything changed, right? Everyone's workflow changed. My access to working with mothers and children, my access to collaborating with students all vanished because we were either online or whatnot. And so I started to work in new ways. And so there was a group in Santa Fe who asked photographers to respond to the question, what does the word transformation mean to you? And it was just a simple prompt, but I was like, well, okay, I'll make work that responds to this. And I started thinking about like supply chain concerns. Like if you remember during this time, we were all fighting over toilet paper. And I started thinking about like consumerism and yeah, made these collages and started to use painterly like materials and whatnot. So I made the piece and then I thought nothing of it and I was like, okay, moving on. But like you'll see threads of this like sort of cutout and collage happening later. And then finally, like one other piece that was just an experiment, you know, I started to think about, well, I lost both of my maternal and my paternal grandmothers within a month of one another. And so I inherited all of these photographs. And so I started going through those photographs and then I started thinking about like how I could make records of my children's lives that were experimental. And I started to think about teeth as a kind of metaphor or a record of one's life, right? You have gums, then you get your little baby teeth that sprout through. Then those are like, the tooth fairy takes those. Here I stole from the tooth fairy to use them for my project. But like, yeah, and then you get your adult teeth and then you get your wisdom teeth. So there's this like passage of time and lineage that's like sort of a record of your teeth. And so I started thinking about what would happen if I put all these milk teeth, these baby teeth on the scanner, and what would happen if I start to blow on the scanner on the teeth as it's scanning? Like, could it make this kind of glitch? Is this a way of talking about like how an image is, it's not always like a stolid state, it can be in a state of flux. So this was sort of, these were my off-ramps that I feel like led to like other things in the body of work that I'll get into now. So yeah, so this work is up on view. Please go see it if you haven't already. But in many ways, place started to inform this work. So I live in New Mexico, and the signs of the climate emergency there really led me to start to think about the intersection between motherhood and the climate crisis. And when we look at pre-industrial perspectives of Earth, we see it being revered as a kind of mother, one that protected us, and in turn that we should do the same, that there was a kind of reciprocal relationship. But in our post-industrial era, things are very different, right? We don't often recognize the limitations of a finite planet. And so I started thinking about, all right, I've spent all this time thinking about motherhood and the social sort of state of what mothers are experiencing, and maybe more largely what parents are experiencing. Is the strain, the social strain that mothers are feeling, is there a connection there between the plight of Mother Earth and the strains that we're putting on it? Like, is she Mother Earth being put, pushed and pulled beyond her capacity due to anthropogenic climate change? So this piece seeks to mark time. I mark the number of days that I've been a mother. At this point, it was 4,789. It's even more now. And I started to think about, like, how can I transform this print? So each day is a whole, and then it's presented in a light box, so it begins to glow more and more. And for me, that was a way of like talking about how motherhood is transforming me and how maybe in many ways we are transforming the planet. And I was really interested in this quote by Doug and Mike Starn, the artist. They say, "A photograph is not only a captured instant, but exists in time and deteriorates and expands with time." And I really like that idea. And in many ways, I think visually with the dot-like structure here, it kind of references that earlier work that I showed you with the LiDAR. So climate change impacts all people across geographical, political, and social lines, and it's arguably the greatest issue of our time. And I think that for me, that this quote by Stephen Jay Gould really encapsulates my aims with this work. He says, "We cannot win this battle to save species and environments without forging an emotional bond between ourselves and nature, for we will not fight to save what we do not love." So there are three questions that really center the work that I'm continue to make. How should we acknowledge environmental grief and our uncertain future? What does it mean to parent in the time of the climate crisis? And how do we reconnect with the earth and begin to mend a damaged planet? So I want to give you like a little bit of a framework to contextualize some of these questions. So a recent survey of over 10,000 participants found that 59% of respondents were extremely worried about climate change, and 84% were found to be at least moderately worried. Climate psychiatrist Van Susseren states, quote, "It's culturally acceptable to talk about all kinds of anxieties, but not the climate." And he concludes, quote, "People need to talk about their grief. When you do nothing, it just gets worse." The last climate reports are daunting. There's a lot to grieve, but there's also a lot to save. The 10 warmest years in the historical record have all occurred in the past decade. 2023 was the warmest year since global records began in 1850, and by a wide margin. By the middle of the 21st century, it is estimated that 30 to 50% of all living species will be eliminated through mass extinction if changes aren't made. And I feel like the first step in acknowledging environmental grief in our uncertain future is to start talking. And I think art is a really powerful tool to start that process. I come from a multi-generational line of farmers from the Midwest, so this neck of the woods is very familiar to me. And they have this, like, especially my grandfather, who's in his 90s, has this like running personal record of his land. He can tell you the years that were dry, the years that were wet, the bug-infested years, the profitable years, like literally going back 50 years, he could tell you this. But I think that photography and farming are connected in that they're fundamentally about paying close attention. To be a good farmer, you have to know your land and pay attention. And attention is one of the things, like one of the greatest things that we possess, but there's much competing for it. Much of that is probably found in your phone in your pocket. Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, says that, quote, "Paying attention is a form of reciprocity with the living world." Caregiving is fundamentally about focused attention. Cultivating that care is paramount in shifting worldviews to combat the climate crisis. In this image, we see examples of attention and care: a mother holding her firstborn, a photograph of a frozen landscape in which nature needs support, and the way a daughter connects to her mother through verse. The figure here supports and attempts to protect others in their kind of shared skin, and yet they extend beyond her means. And I think this is in many ways could be a metaphor for Earth's attempt to keep up with the humans' demands upon it. And so I pose, like, how can we alter our behavior to live within the means of what the Earth can provide? So in 2022, the Calf Canyon Herbert's Peak fire happened. It was the largest and most destructive wildfire in the history of New Mexico, burning 241,000 plus acres. And I this was primarily happening about an hour away from where I live in Mora County, which is where Little Las Vegas, New Mexico is located, a place where I had taught for 8 years and had lived. But it also the Sangre de Cristo Mountains that you have in Santa Fe faces towards that direction. So we would see these massive plumes of smoke that are called pyrocumulus nimbus clouds, which are basically fire clouds. But they often would look like an atomic bomb had been set off. And being the birthplace of that in New Mexico was very unnerving. And this was happening daily. And so I started to think about this climate emergency is not something that happens like over there. It wasn't something that was just happening in Canada or something that happens in California or something that happens to Florida. But like now it was like in my hometown, and I felt like I had to sort of start to kind of think about the climate emergency in my kids' adolescence as tethered and as a kind of story arc in their life. So I collapsed the ongoing climate crisis to my children's lineage and impending adulthood to recognize that the two are connected and tethered. This image, called New Mexico Fires, collapses the boundaries of a damaged environment, these fires in the background, with those of the human form to show connection and responsibility. I scanned school pictures of my children from various ages and layered those on top of one another, and then cut those out, and then layered two pigment prints on top of one another to create this image. But I was interested in like how school pictures are a marker of time. Like, this is what you looked like in 4th grade, and this is what you looked like in 6th grade, right? But maybe they also should be increasingly a marker of what's happening to the health of our environment. And you know, as a parent, I'm concerned for the environmental future that my kids and all kids will be inheriting, and the responsibility that they will have to care for a damaged planet. So I started thinking about this idea of like a shared breath, and part of this came to be in a couple of different ways. One, the fires were so intense that NASA was actually recording satellite imagery of them, and I was like, this is incredible, like what is happening? And then also at the same time I started thinking about like, well, we're breathing in this air, right? Like, and this isn't just trees that are on fire, which is always a sad thing in New Mexico, but this is also people's homes, and this means this is plastic, and this is rubber, and this is paper, and like all these things are going into the air. And so I had the opportunity to speak to a medical educator who specializes in climate health care, and she had a lot of information about research that she's been doing about the impact of particulates on health, specifically due to asthma, and like strokes are caused by these particulates. And so I started to see like, well, okay, the inseparability of the health of our landscape and the health of the body are like, those are like inseparable now. So for me, these pieces are also using those pyrocumulonimbus clouds, and they're pairing like layers of family photos on top of one another. And I think there's like a beauty to the form, and yet the cause is terrifying. And the work aims to kind of seduce the viewer to look at the ramifications of the climate crisis while motivating one to combat it. And as Naomi Klein states, to begin to heal the earth, we must break down our illusions of separateness. And that felt very resonant when these fires were happening in New Mexico. So I talked a little bit earlier about practice and process, and you know, I feel like I draw inspiration in a lot of different ways, but I'm bringing one in that's actually from my oldest kid, Elliot. And he had like used a magnifying glass and like harnessed the sun to like burn his name into these leaves, and like gave it to me, and I had it in my office for a really long time, and I was like, something's cool about this, like this is kind of interesting. And you know, at one level, it's kind of a child's play, like a gesture of love, but it feels also like a desire of humans to sear their will upon the earth. And I thought about this in a really different way when the fires were happening in New Mexico. And so I remade that idea with Elliot. So he's a master burner. And so I had him burn on the leaves for me and find them. And so I started to think about the idea of like using the word mother as a way of like referencing Mother Earth. And so we burnt these leaves, Elliot burnt the leaves, and then we put them on top of a mirror. And then here I started thinking about like, well, is there a way that I can use these satellite imagery but in a more abstracted way? So I just made this ginormous print and then held it up above the mirror to reflect it. So kind of like, I guess, iterating a little bit on how I had like previously used this approach. And for me, there's kind of irony here, because these fires actually started as a prescribed burn. So it was a desire to care for and maybe control nature that got out of control, and there's a lot of damage that happened as a result of that. And I think that the climate crisis, due to its extractive practices, such as oil and gas, which are big in our state, has resulted in a drier environment. In fact, the New Mexico fire season has lengthened by 2 months over the past 40 years, so now 7 months out of the year we're in fire danger. So I started thinking about these ideas in reference to kind of like linguistic markers. And I started thinking about the development of a child's life. So we talk about a bloodline continuing. We talk about a gum line or a hairline, right? Markers of the beginning of a child's birth. And We also talk about like portions of a landscape, right? We have natural and man-made sections. So a shoreline would be the natural one, or a pipeline, which is not, or a fire line. And I started thinking about, tried to sort of rethink about worldviews and a relationship to the earth through these lines. Like first, do these lines really exist? And if so, is there mutability between them? And I asked my daughter to write in cursive because I feel like that's like a symbol of learning and intention in education, to write these different words. And it made me start to think about like, you know, what are we teaching our children in terms of worldview and their connection to nature? A pipeline or a fire line could ultimately impact one's lifeline. My investigation into linguistic connections led me to consider the idea of a kind of collapsed family portrait. I layer portraits of each family member to create a kind of collapsed family portrait. Like, what do we look like as a unit? What changes will occur to my bloodline as a result of the climate emergency? And this idea, to me, speaks of notions of epigenetics. So the study of epigenetics describes the mutability of our genes and how aspects of them can be turned on or off due to what we consume, our environment, and how long we live. So studies have shown that like the water that one drinks, the food one eats, or the air that one breathes, most importantly for me in this context, as well as you know, toxins that are in a given environment, periods of starvation, or intense stress can actually impact these genes, the expression of them. So environmental epigenetics looks at the impact of climate change on genes. We see in butterflies that a shift in temperature can change their coloring, affecting reproduction and their ability to hide from predators. And so I started to think about like, can environmental impacts due to the climate change, such as breathing in the smoke of a forest fire, impact the expression of future generations' genes? And there's a really interesting article in the New York Times about epigenetics, and I think it illustrates this idea of like humans' response to environmental shifts and change. So they talk about this northern part of Sweden, which is called Overkalax in the article. And this particular part, this region, was very isolated, especially in the wintertime. So when the Baltic Sea would freeze over, basically, if they had bad harvests, children would starve. If they had good harvests, children would like stuff themselves. But they were like, there was no food coming in, right? It was just what they could produce in their community. And Swedish scientists like started to study records from 1799 on, and what they saw is really interesting. They saw that boys that ate poorly during the years right before puberty, that their sons as adults had lower than normal rates of heart disease. And then they saw the boys that ate all too well during those periods, that their grandsons had higher rates of diabetes. So you can see like this direct correlation with, like, in this case, access to food and like literally the expression of their genes. So pretty fascinating. To me, epigenetics points to our inseparableness and delicate relationship with the natural world. Like, we are tethered. And I think that idea is illustrated in Ellen Bass's poem. It's called The Big Picture, where she contemplates environmental collapse and what really matters in the end. So I'm gonna, if you will entertain me, I'll read you this poem. I try to look at the big picture, the sun, ardent tongue, licking us like a mother besotted with her new cub, will wear itself out. Everything is transitory. Think of the meteor that annihilated the dinosaurs, and before that the volcanoes of the Permian period, all those burnt ferns, and reptiles, sharks, and bony fish. That was an extinction on a scale that makes our losses look like a bad day at the slots. And perhaps we're slated to ascend to some kind of intelligence that doesn't need bodies or clean water or even air. But I can't shake my longing for the last 600 Iberian lynx with their tufted ears. Brazilian guitarfish, the 4% of them still cruising the sea floor, eyes staring straight up. And all the newborn marsupials, red kangaroos, joeys the size of honeybees, steelhead trout, river dolphins, all we can save. So many species of frogs breathing through their damp, permeable membranes. Today on the bus, a woman in a sweater, the exact shade of cardinals, and her cardinal-colored bra strap exposed on her pale shoulder, makes me ache for those bright flashes in the snow. And polar bears, the cream and amber of their fur, the long hollow hairs through which sun slips, swallowed into their dark skin. When I get home, my son has a headache, and though he's almost grown, asks me to sing him a song. We lie together on the lumpy couch, and I warble out the old show tunes, night and day. They can't take that away from me. A cheap silver chain shimmers across his throat, rising and falling with his pulse. There never was anything else, only these excruciatingly insignificant creatures we love. For me, the line, there never was anything else, only these excruciatingly insignificant creatures we love, echoes my desire to connect my love for my children with the larger environment for which they are a part. As a way to illustrate that connection, I look to the materiality of ice, something that I've used throughout my career to speak to impending change and fluidity. I make molds of my children's teeth using a plastic retainer meant to control and correct one's teeth as a visual connection to the fleeting time that we have left to change course and how that dovetails with the limited time my children have before they enter adulthood. Scientists claim that we have until 2030, until the point of irreversible change. In an effort to step out beyond my own life and give a platform for eco-grief and personal reflection, I created a public work called Cyanograms, Shadows Cast on Ephemeral Futures, in collaboration with my colleague at the University of New Mexico, Amaris Ketchum, and 2 honor students, Ethan Ward and Victoria Nasoli. And for us, we were interested in engaging the UNM community to find out how they were feeling about the climate emergency. And so we created this survey, and we had hundreds of students respond, and we used their responses to create poetry about their concerns about the environment, and then we photographed them as part of this as well, and collaged various aspects. But it was interesting, like after we did this process, it gave us a better sense of like the pulse of what was happening on our campus and how students felt. And it also kind of interestingly dovetailed with a study that came out of Yale, and their climate studies there found that first-person accounts of climate change are more successful than hard scientific data in changing people's perspectives about the climate crisis. So for here, like I'm sure you have like fishermen in the state, and like them talking about how they had been fishing in the same spot for many years, and like there were less fish now, or like the algae seemed like it was growing, or the water seems like it's receding. Those sort of narratives started to change public perception much more than scientific accounts. I thought that was really interesting. So Anya Elizabeth Johnson was one of the co-authors of the book, All We Can Save, Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis. And she states, quote, "We need to have a whole cultural shift where it becomes our culture to take care of the earth. And in order to make this shift, we need storytelling about how the earth takes care of us and how we can take care of her." And I hope this presentation has illustrated the arc of my creative work, one that looks carefully and critically at delicate relationships and lobbies for a more interconnected worldview. Thank you so much for your time and consideration. I do want to leave you, the teacher in me can't leave you without next steps. But if you're interested in this subject matter, I think these books are really incredible in terms of reading more about ways that we can engage and help heal the planet. And yeah, thank you so much for your time.